blood stained the dusty floorboards of the Silver City Saloon, but it wasn't the deafening gunfire that froze the town in terror. It was the fragile whisper that followed, a single, desperate plea from the richest heiress in the territory to a no-name drifter. "Do it. Hurry up." The year was 1883, and Owyhee County, Idaho Territory, was a place where God's mercy seemed to evaporate before it ever hit the cracked, alkaline soil. The Owyhee Mountains loomed like jagged teeth against an endless, punishing sky. In this unforgiving landscape, power wasn't measured in paper money. It was measured in water, cattle, and the lead required to protect them. William Higgins was a man who once had all three. His ranch, the Broken Yoke, spanned thousands of acres along the winding tributaries of the Snake River. But a mysterious, 2-year drought had crippled his operations. The creeks had dried to muddy trickles, the prairie grass had turned to brittle ash, and his cattle were dying by the dozens. William's daughter, Clara Higgins, bore the weight of her father's failing empire on her shoulders. At 22, Clara was the antithesis of the delicate parlor room women back east. She had sun-kissed skin, calloused hands from working the reins, and a fiery independence that terrified the local bachelors. But independence was a luxury the Higgins family could no longer afford. Enter Josiah Gentry. Gentry was a ruthless cattle baron who had moved into the valley 3 years prior. He owned the sprawling Ironwood Ranch upriver, and rumor had it he employed a private army of Pinkertons and outlaws to enforce his will. While the rest of the county withered, Ironwood flourished. Gentry had made William Higgins a proposition he would forgive the exorbitant loans William had taken from Gentry's bank, and he would grant the Broken Yoke access to his dammed-up reservoirs. In exchange, he wanted Clara's hand in a marriage. It wasn't a proposal, it was a foreclosure notice disguised as a wedding invitation. Clara had resigned herself to the sacrifice. She would sell her soul to the devil to keep her father from dying a broken man. The wedding was set for the end of October. Then the drifter arrived. It was a blistering Tuesday afternoon when a solitary rider descended the ridge into the Broken Yoke. The man sat tall in the saddle of a scarred roan gelding. He wore a faded canvas duster, a low-pulled Stetson, and a Colt .45 tied down to his thigh with the worn leather of a man who used it often. William, desperate for cheap labor to help dig new wells, hired him on the spot for 50 cents a day. The man gave only one name, Jeremiah. Most the hands just called him J. Tseto Anohaite Dototi. From the moment Clara laid eyes on the fragile, terrible peace she had made with her fate began to unravel. He wasn't like the loud, boasting cowpokes who usually rode the Idaho trails. J. Date possessed a quiet, dangerous stillness. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, seemed to strip away the tough exterior Clara projected to the world, seeing straight to the terrified woman beneath. Their first real encounter happened 3 days after his arrival. Clara was in the barn, struggling to calm a panicked, half-broken Mustang that had gotten its leg tangled in a lead rope. The horse was thrashing violently, its hooves kicking up clouds of suffocating dust. Clara, refusing to back down, was inches from being trampled. Suddenly, a gloved hand grabbed her waist, hauling her back with staggering force just as a heavy hoof splintered the stall door where she had been standing. Didn't say a word. He stepped past her, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace. He didn't use a whip or a shout. He simply walked up to the thrashing animal, speaking in a low, gravelly murmur that Clara couldn't quite hear. Within seconds, The mustang ceased its struggling, trembling as J.T. gently untangled the rope and stroked its sweat-lathered neck. Pride is a fine thing. Miss Higgins, J. said softly, not turning to look at her as he secured the horse. But it won't stop 1,000 pounds of bone and muscle from crushing your skull. Clara swallowed the lump in her throat, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. It wasn't just fear from the near miss, it was the proximity of him, the smell of leather, sage, and masculine sweat. I had it under control. Mr. Jeremiah, J.T. finally turned. The corners of his mouth twitched in the ghost of a smile, revealing a devastating, rugged charm that caught Clara entirely off guard. If you say so, ma'am. Over the next few weeks, a silent, magnetic pull drew them together. Clara found herself making excuses to visit the far pastures where J.T. was mending fences. She brought him water. He offered her a shaded spot under a cottonwood tree. They spoke of the land, of the dying cattle, and eventually of the impending marriage that hung over Clara like a hangman's noose. You don't look at gentry the way a woman looks at a man she's about to marry. J.T. observed one evening as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in violent shades of crimson and bruised purple. Clara looked away, her jaw tight. I'm marrying him to save my father's legacy. Love doesn't factor into survival. Survival isn't living, Clara, he replied, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it on his lips sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. He stepped closer. Clara didn't retreat. When his rough, calloused fingers reached out to gently tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear, the unspoken electricity between them finally grounded. She looked up into those stormy eyes and saw a reflection of her own desperate longing. But in Owyhee County, secrets never stayed buried in the dust for long. Josiah Gentry was not a man who missed much. He noticed the way Clara's gaze lingered on the new ranch hand during a Sunday dinner at the Broken Yoke. He noticed the sudden, defiant spark returning to Clara's eyes, a spark he had spent months trying to extinguish. Gentry decided it was time to tighten the leash. The very next morning, the water trickling from the upriver dam stopped entirely. Gentry's foreman, a vicious brute named Cletus Miller, rode on to the Broken Yoke with a sneering message for William Higgins. The marriage date is moved up. The wedding happens this Sunday, or the ironwood forecloses by Monday morning. Clara was devastated. Her timeline had vanished. The trap had slammed shut. That night, a torrential rainstorm, the first in months, finally broke over the valley. It was a violent, booming tempest that turned the parched earth into a sea of slick mud. Under the cover of the deafening thunder, Clara threw a heavy wool cloak over her nightgown and ran from the main house down to the bunkhouse. She didn't care about propriety anymore. She only knew she couldn't marry Josiah Gentry. She burst into the small, dimly lit tack room where J.T. had taken up residence away from the other hands. J.T. was sitting on a hay bale, cleaning his colt by the light of a single kerosene lantern. He looked up, unsurprised by her sudden entrance, though his eyes darkened at the sight of her soaking wet, trembling form. They moved it up, Clara choked out, the tears finally mixing with the rain on her cheeks. Sunday. I have to marry him on Sunday. J.T. set the revolver down with a heavy thud. He stood, closing the distance between them, and wrapped his arms around her. Clara collapsed against his chest, gripping his shirt as if he were the only solid thing left in the world. "I can't do it, Jeremiah," she sobbed into his shoulder. "I can't let that monster touch me. Please, just take me away. We can ride out tonight. Let Gentry have the land. I don't care anymore." J.T. held her tight, his hand stroking her damp hair. But when he spoke, his voice was laced with a chilling, metallic resolve that made Clara pull back and look at him. "We aren't running." "Clara, what do you mean?" Panic flared in her eyes. "If I stay, I belong to him. You don't belong to anyone." "J.T." said fiercely. He turned back to the makeshift table and picked up a weathered leather satchel he kept hidden under his cot. He threw it onto the table and unbuckled the straps. "I didn't come to Owyhee County by accident. Clara, J.J. confessed, his voice dropping to a gravelly register that commanded absolute silence in the small room. "My real name is Jeremiah Thomas. 3 years ago, I was a deputy U.S. Marshal in the Wyoming Territory. My younger brother, Elias, owned a small spread outside of Cheyenne. He refused to sell to a conglomerate of corrupt bankers." Clara's breath hitched as she stared at the contents of the satchel. Inside were bundles of legal documents, worn telegraphs, and a tarnished silver marshal's star. "They hired men to burn his ranch to the ground," Tate continued, his eyes locked on the wall, seeing ghosts. Elias burned with it. The local law was bought and paid for. They ruled it an accidental fire. I handed in my badge and spent the last 3 years hunting down the men who gave the order. He turned his gaze back to Clara, and the lethal intensity in his eyes made her gasp. "Josiah Gentry wasn't always a rancher in Idaho. He was a banker in Wyoming. He gave the order to burn my brother alive." The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. The quiet, brooding ranch hand she had fallen in love with was a phantom of vengeance. The drought on your land isn't natural. J. Revealed. Stepping closer. "I've been riding the upper ridge at night. Gentry isn't just damming the water. He's got his men dumping alkaline salts and lye into the tributaries that feed the broken yoke. He's deliberately poisoning the soil so your father goes bankrupt. He wants this valley, and he wants you as a trophy to prove he owns the Higgins legacy." "My God," Clara whispered, horror washing over her. "We have to tell the sheriff. Sheriff Flynn is on Gentry's payroll." J.T. said flatly, "I have the proof. I have the ledgers I stole from Gentry's safe in Cheyenne. But proof doesn't mean a damn thing in a town where the judge and the law answer to the man I'm trying to hang." J.T. grabbed his gun belt, strapping it around his waist with practiced, deadly efficiency. I was waiting for the right moment to strike. I wanted to dismantle his entire operation, but moving the wedding up forces my hand. Clara grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his muscle. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to finish what started in Wyoming." Clara looked at the man she loved, a man teetering on the edge of becoming a murderer to save her and avenge his brother. She thought of her father, of the dying cattle, of Gentry's vile, triumphant smirk. The law had failed them. Society had failed them. In the wild, untamed expanse of the West, justice was often delivered at the end of a barrel. She reached up, her hands framing Jay's rough face. She pulled him down, kissing him with a desperate, consuming fire that sealed their fates together, when she pulled away. The terrified girl was gone. In her place stood a woman of the West, forged in hardship and betrayal. "Then do it," Clara whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. Her eyes flicked to the heavy Colt resting against his thigh. "Do it. Hurry up." Sunday morning broke over Owyhee County with a cruel, mocking brightness. Silver City, a bustling, chaotic mining town built on a steep canyon side, had been effectively bought out for the day by Josiah Gentry. The lavish Grand Hotel and its adjoining high-end saloon had been draped in imported white lace and pale desert roses. It was a grotesque display of wealth in a territory starving for a single drop of rain. Clara Higgins stood in a private room above the saloon, staring at her reflection in a clouded vanity mirror. She was draped in heavy white silk, a gown shipped all the way from Chicago. It felt less like a wedding dress and more like a finely tailored shroud. Her father, William, sat in a velvet armchair in the corner. The proud, booming cattleman looked completely hollowed out, a ghost of the patriarch he had been just a year prior. He clutched his Stetson in trembling hands, his eyes locked on the floorboards. "You don't have to do this, Clara," William whispered, his voice cracking. "Let him take the broken yoke. We can pack the wagon. We can go to California. Start over." Clara turned to her father, forcing a brave, heart-breaking smile. "There is no starting over. Papa, Gentry's bank holds the notes on everything we own. He'd have the territorial marshals hunt us down as debtors before we crossed the state line. This is the only way." She didn't mention J.T. She hadn't seen the brooding drifter since that tempestuous night in the tack room. When she had awoken the next morning, his roan gelding was gone, and the bunkhouse was empty. A cold, sinking dread had gnawed at her heart all weekend. Had he abandoned her? Had Gentry's men discovered his true identity and killed him? Or was he out there, waiting in the jagged shadows of the canyon? Downstairs, the grandfather clock struck noon. The heavy, oppressive silence of the saloon was broken by the grating chords of a parlor piano, striking up a bridal march. Gentry was waiting at the makeshift altar by the swinging batwing doors, looking every inch the conquering emperor. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, a gold pocket watch gleaming against his vest. Flanking him were his top enforcers, including the sneering Cletus Miller, who kept his hand resting casually on the butt of his sidearm, even in the presence of the terrified local preacher. As Clara descended the staircase, the room fell dead silent. Gentry's eyes roamed over her with a sickening, possessive hunger. He stepped forward, taking her cold, trembling hand in his. "You look exquisite, my dear," Gentry murmured, his breath smelling of expensive cigars and peppermint. "A fitting queen for the empire I've built." Clara stared straight ahead, her face a mask of pale porcelain. The preacher cleared his throat, his hands shaking as he opened his Bible. He rushed through the opening rites, the words blurring together in Clara's panicked mind. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to run, to fight, but the heavy reality of her father's life pinned her in place. If any man can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, the preacher stammered, sweating profusely. Let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace. A heavy, suffocating silence hung in the saloon. Clara closed her eyes. He's not coming, she thought, a tear finally escaping and cutting a warm track down her powdered cheek. I am entirely alone. Bang! The deafening explosion of a gunshot shattered the piano music. The heavy brass chandelier above the altar swung violently, showering glass and plaster over the terrified guests. The batwing doors were violently kicked open. The bright, blinding noon sun poured into the dim saloon, silhouetting a lone figure standing in the dusty street. It was J.T. He had shed his drifter's canvas duster. He stood in a crisp white shirt and a black vest. Twin Colt 45s strapped low on his thighs. But it was the object pinned to his chest that made the entire room freeze in absolute terror. Gleaming in the sunlight was the silver, star-shaped badge of a United States Deputy Marshal. "I object," J.T. stated, his voice ringing out with lethal, chilling authority. Chaos erupted with the sudden, violent force of a dynamite blast. The heavy, suffocating silence that had gripped the saloon was instantly shredded by the screams of terrified wedding guests. Women in their finest silk dresses shrieked and dove blindly beneath the heavy oak poker tables, while men who had never seen a real gunfight scrambled frantically toward the side exits, trampling over one another in a desperate bid for the street. The cowardly preacher didn't even pause to retrieve his dropped Bible. He scrambled over the altar rail and bolted through the kitchen doors, disappearing into the alleyway. "Kill him!" Josiah Gentry roared. His veneer of aristocratic sophistication evaporated in a fraction of a second, replaced by a mask of pure, primal, ugly rage. He shoved Clara roughly aside, practically throwing her toward the piano as he scrambled backward to put his men between himself and the federal lawman standing in the doorway. Cletus Miller, Gentry's towering, vicious foreman, was fast. He had built a bloody reputation in the territory on his quick draw, but Cletus was pulling his weapon against a man who had spent the last 3 years consumed by the cold, unrelenting fire of vengeance. Jeremiah Thomas didn't just draw, he moved with the terrifying, practiced fluidity of a seasoned U.S. Deputy Marshal. Before Cletus's revolver could even clear its leather holster, J.T. fanned the hammer of his right Colt. 2 deafening shots rang out in rapid succession, the muzzle flashes blindingly bright in the dim saloon. The heavy .45 caliber slugs caught Cletus square in the chest. The massive foreman was thrown violently backward over a velvet-draped card table. Dead before his boots even settled on the floorboards. 2 more of Gentry's hired guns opened fire from the overlooking second-floor balcony. Bullets rained down, tearing through the floorboards at J.T.'s feet. Wood splintered around him as he executed a flawless, rolling dive behind the massive, imported mahogany bar. The saloon quickly filled with the acrid, choking smoke of black powder. The deafening roar of gunfire echoed off the canyon walls of Silver City, turning the lavish, lace-draped wedding venue into a suffocating slaughterhouse. J.T. reloaded with mechanical precision, his hands moving entirely on muscle memory. He popped up from behind the shattered bar, ignoring the hail of lead raining down on the mirrored glass behind him, and returned fire. He wasn't just fighting for his own life, and he wasn't just fighting for Clara. He was executing a federal warrant signed in his murdered brother's ashes. With 2 sharp cracks of his left Colt, the gunmen on the balcony pitched forward, crashing through the wooden railing and plummeting into the sea of overturned tables below. Suddenly, the deafening barrage of gunfire stopped. An eerie, ringing silence fell over the smoke-filled room, broken only by the whimpers of the guests huddled beneath the tables and the steady drip of whiskey from bullet-holed casks behind the bar. J.T. slowly stepped out from behind the ruined mahogany counter, both revolvers leveled and ready, his boots crunching on shattered glass and discarded bullet casings. As the thick clouds of gun smoke began to drift toward the ceiling, the horrific tableau at the back of the room revealed itself, making J's blood run absolutely cold. Josiah Gentry had retreated to the far rear wall of the saloon. He had grabbed Clara during the chaos and now held her in a vice-like, panicked grip, using her ruined white silk dress as a human shield. Pressed tight against Clara's temple was the cold, snub-nosed steel barrel of Gentry's silver Derringer pocket pistol. "Drop them, Marshal," Gentry spat, his voice cracking hysterically. A manic, desperate sweat poured down his red face, ruining his expensive collar. "Drop the damn guns or I blow her brains all over this imported wallpaper." From the corner of the room, William Higgins screamed his daughter's name, attempting to crawl toward her, but a surviving thug stepped forward and viciously clubbed the old rancher down with the brass-plated butt of a repeating rifle. J.T. froze in his tracks. His steel-grey eyes locked instantly with Clara's. Her face was pale, smeared with soot, gun smoke, and dust, but her eyes were remarkably clear. The trembling, defeated girl who had resigned herself to a loveless marriage was completely gone. "You think you've won, Thomas?" Gentry sneered, taking a slow, shuffling step backward toward the saloon's rear exit door, dragging Clara with him. "You think a piece of tin pinned to your chest means anything out here in the dirt? I own this town. I own the judge. I own the sheriff. Even if you kill me, they'll hang you for murder by nightfall. It's not murder. Gentry." "J.T.," said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the silence like a hunting knife. He didn't lower his weapons even an inch. "I found your paymaster in Cheyenne. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency has the ledgers. Charles Siringo himself is riding in from Denver with a detachment of federal troops authorized by Territorial Governor Neal. It's over, Josiah. Your empire is dead, and the hangman is already measuring your drop." The mention of the legendary Pinkerton detective, Charles Siringo, and the governor's direct involvement made Gentry violently flinch. For a split second, the corrupt banker's arrogant, untouchable facade cracked, replaced by the sheer, cornered panic of a trapped rat. His grip on Clara's waist loosened by a fraction of a millimeter. It was the only opening she needed. Clara didn't scream for help. She didn't struggle aimlessly. She simply looked straight down the barrel of J.T.'s right Colt, her eyes burning with a fierce, unbreakable resolve and a profound, reckless love. She knew the risk. She knew the timing had to be perfect. Blood from the balcony gunman stained the dusty floorboards of the Silver City saloon. But it wasn't the deafening gunfire or the smell of death that froze the town in terror. It was the fragile, echoing whisper that followed. A single, desperate plea from the richest heiress in the territory to a no-name drifter, turned lawman, "Do it! Hurry up!" As she breathed the words, Clara violently threw her entire body weight backward, snapping her head back and slamming her skull directly into the bridge of Josiah Gentry's nose. The sickening crunch of bone echoed in the quiet room. The banker shrieked in sudden agony, stumbling blindly backward as his vision flashed white. His grip faltered just enough. Clara instantly dropped her weight, throwing herself flat against the blood-soaked, glass-covered floorboards, tucking her head behind her arms. The thunderous crack of J.T.'s Colt was louder than anything that had preceded it. The heavy bullet struck Josiah Gentry perfectly square in the center of his chest. The impact lifted the corrupt baron off his feet. He crashed backward through the saloon's large rear window, shattering the thick glass into 1,000 glittering pieces and collapsing heavily into the dusty alleyway beneath the blinding midday sun. He didn't twitch. He didn't breathe. It was over. Jay holstered his smoking weapons in a blur, rushing across the devastated room and sliding to his knees beside Clara. He pulled her fiercely into his arms, crushing her against his chest as she finally let out a ragged, shaking breath, burying her face into his shoulder. The pristine white silk of her dress was utterly ruined, stained with soot, gunpowder, and blood. But as Jay held her tight against his beating heart, she had never looked more beautiful, true to J.T.'s word. 3 days later, the legendary detective Charles Siringo rode into Silver City, flanked by federal troops. With Gentry dead and the damning financial ledgers recovered from the Ironwood Ranch safe, the vast, corrupt conspiracy was laid bare for the entire territory to see. Gentry's remaining thugs and the bought-off local sheriff were rounded up in irons and sent to the territorial prison. A federal judge immediately ordered the corrupted, illegal dam to be destroyed with dynamite, and the sweet, life-giving waters of the Snake River tributaries finally roared back into the parched lands of the Broken Yoke Ranch. William Higgins slowly regained his health and his spirit, spending his mornings on the porch, watching his cattle graze on pastures that were finally turning a vibrant, hopeful green. But he no longer ran the massive cattle empire alone. 6 months after the bloody shootout in Silver City, a very different kind of wedding took place. It wasn't held in a lavish hotel, and there was no imported lace or parlor piano. It was held outdoors, under the sprawling, protective shade of a massive cottonwood tree on the open plains of Idaho. Clara Higgins stood radiant in a simple, beautiful blue cotton dress, her hand resting securely and forever in the calloused, gentle grip of Jeremiah Thomas. J.T. had permanently retired his Silver Marshal's star, choosing the quiet, enduring life of a rancher over the endless, bloody trail of the law. As they exchanged their vows, surrounded by honest, hard-working ranch hands, and beneath the endless, sweeping western sky, Clara knew she had finally found a love that could weather absolutely any storm. Did the courage of Clara and J.T. leave you breathless? The Wild West was built on tales of outlaws, unyielding love, and frontier justice. But few rival the shocking showdown at the Broken Yoke. If you loved this thrilling, true-life historical drama, hit that like button, share this wild tale with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more untold, epic stories from the untamed American frontier.